Marco Rubio stood at the Munich Security Conference in February and said something extraordinary. He told European allies it was time to stop feeling guilty about colonial history. He invoked the legacy of the great Western empires approvingly. He called for the West to be reinvigorated. A senior American official at the world's most important security gathering asked Europe to stop apologizing for empire and to start rebuilding one. Most coverage treated it as rhetoric, a diplomatic posture, something to file under Trump administration bluster and move on. But here is the thing. The populations of the global south did not need Rubio's speech to understand what he was describing. They have been living inside the logic he articulated for the past 300 years. The speech was not a signal of something new. It was a rare moment of candor about something very old. In 1772, the East India Company was broke. It had unpaid bills of £1.6 million against assets worth less than £5 million. It had been extracting wealth from the Indian subcontinent for over a century, running its own army, administering its own territory, operating as a sovereign power in everything but name, and it had run out of road. It went to the Bank of England for an emergency loan. The bank could not cover it alone. The crisis spread to Amsterdam, then across Europe, the first global financial contagion on record. What happened next is the part worth understanding. The company's debts did not fall on the company's shareholders. They were absorbed into the British national debt. Parliament restructured the obligation so that dividends, once paid from trade profits, were now paid from tax revenue, extracted from the same Indian population the company had spent a century plundering. The shareholders kept their returns. The losses went to the colonized. The empire did not collapse. The state absorbed the failure, distributed the cost downward and outward, and kept going. This is the mechanism this channel has been tracing since its first episode, not in the abstract, in the specific documented history of how wealth moves upward toward those who extracted it, and downward and outward towards those from whom it was taken. The Sykes-Picot agreement was not a line drawn on a map. It was the same mechanism applied to sovereignty. The costs of imperial competition distributed onto the populations of the Muslim world, the benefits retained by the empires that drew the line. What we are about to show you is not a new story. It is the same story in a suit in 2026. BlackRock manages over $14 trillion, more than the combined GDP of the entire European Union. Its risk software Aladdin monitors approximately $18 trillion in assets, including at various points the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, the New York Fed did not turn to another bank or a government agency. It hired BlackRock. In the years since, over 100 people have moved through the revolving door between BlackRock and the federal government. Then, in January 2026, Rick Ryder, BlackRock's chief investment officer, personally responsible for $2.4 trillion in fixed income assets, became one of the final four candidates to chair the Federal Reserve. The institution that sets the price of money in America was considering handing its top job to a senior executive of the private firm whose software it already depends on to manage crises. This is in congressional letters. It is in BlackRock's own earnings calls. 7 $100 billion in new capital in 12 months, elevated momentum, the firm called it. The East India Company did not need to control Parliament directly. It needed Parliament's debt, the Bank of England's credit, and the Crown's military to be available when the extraction model needed backing. BlackRock does not need to control the Federal Reserve directly. It needs the Fed's balance sheet, the Treasury's debt, and the dollar's reserve status to be available when its model needs liquidity. Different name, different century. The private institution grows until its stability and the state's stability are the same question. At that point, it is no longer regulated by the state. It is the state's problem to manage. And the populations who bear the cost of that arrangement are not the shareholders. They never are. They are the countries that must price their oil in dollars, the nations that must integrate their economies into a trading system whose terms they did not set and cannot change. The people on the other side of the Sykes-Picot line. So why is Rubio in Munich talking about reinvigorating Western empires? The East India Company's debts became Britain's debts. Extraction from India paid them off. The language of civilizing mission justified it. When the company finally failed, the arrangement didn't end, it became the Raj. The same extraction, same population paying for it, new name on the letterhead. BlackRock works the same way. The dollar needs the rest of the world to keep using it. When that needs defending, the language is Western values and great power competition. The institution doesn't have to survive for the arrangement to survive. That's why the architecture doesn't collapse. When one region stops paying, it moves. The function continues. The costs land somewhere else. This channel is called the Sykes-Picot Prism because in 1916, two officials drew a line through the Muslim world that was presented to the public as administrative necessity and understood by everyone on the receiving end as exactly what it was. The distribution of the costs of empire onto those least able to resist it. The line is still there, the mechanism is still running, the names on the letterhead have changed. That is what Rubio's speech sounds like when you place it next to the BlackRock data. Not rhetoric, not bluster. A system describing its own needs in the only language available to it, the language of values, civilization, and the responsibility of great nations. Those of us who learned a different history recognize it immediately. The world is complex, the noise is deliberate, the spectrum cuts through it.